Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take those, daunting stacks of research, those dense articles and historical accounts, and really boil them down to the essential knowledge you need. No heavy lifting required on your part.
That's right. And today we're diving deep into a really fascinating intersection of military strategy, logistics, and geography. We're focusing specifically on the opening phase of the South African War, what most people know as the Boer War, that critical period between 1899 and 1900.
Just those first 6 months, really. But they absolutely set the stage for the entire conflict.
They really did. And our guide for this exploration is, well, frankly, extraordinary. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan of the U.S. Navy.
Mahan. Now, most people, if they know Mahan, know him as the naval strategist, right? The guy who basically wrote the book on sea power.
Exactly. His work defined modern navies. But what's so compelling here is that he turns that same intensely analytical mind away from the ocean and onto the land, onto the dust and heat of the South African veldt.
And he dissects the land campaigns, the triumphs, the failures with this incredible clarity. It's a perspective you don't often get.
It really is. So our mission today, for you listening, is basically a shortcut to understanding the raw strategic and logistical realities that just dominated this war from the outset.
We're going beyond just listing battle names, Major Fontaine, Colenso, Paardeberg. We want to get at the why.
The why behind victory and defeat. We're looking at the crucial choices, the decisions made by both the Boers and the British, and maybe most importantly, how the geography itself, this harsh, isolated landscape, dictated almost everything in those first 6 months.
So you're going to walk away really understanding these enduring principles of warfare, principles demonstrated thousands of miles from Britain's home base.
Principles Mahan saw playing out in real time.
Okay, so Mahan, being Mahan, always starts with the big picture, the strategic theater. And for South Africa, for centuries, the defining feature was just how isolated it was.
Utterly isolated. For the longest time, it was really just an inconvenient stopover, a place to get water and supplies at the very edge of the known world.
A sort of necessary evil on the way somewhere else.
Precisely. Its only real global significance came from the Cape of Good Hope, being one of only two ways. The other being Cape Horn, way down south, to get ships from the Atlantic to the Indian and the Pacific Oceans.
So that Dutch settlement back in 1652 at the Cape, that wasn't about settling South Africa itself.
Primarily, no. It was purely strategic, a halfway house for the Dutch East India Company's trade routes, a vital refueling point.
But then technology changed the game. Mahan points out that this isolation, this sort of marginal importance, got chipped away.
It did by two major 19th century shifts. First, steam power for ships that made voyages faster, more reliable, less dependent on finding good harbors with reliable winds.
Less need for that halfway house.
Exactly. And the second, even bigger blow, was the Suez Canal, opened in 1869.
Which basically let ships bypass Africa altogether on the way to Asia?
Completely bypassed it. Suddenly, South Africa wasn't even on the main route anymore. Geographically, for global trade, it became almost irrelevant overnight.
A strategic backwater. An economic dead end. Until
gold and diamonds.
Right. The discovery of absolutely immense mineral wealth. First diamonds at Kimberley, then the huge gold fields in the Transvaal.
And that, just flipped the script entirely. Suddenly, this isolated region is back in the global spotlight, fiercely. All this wealth, all this foreign interest, mostly British, poured in.
Creating the very tensions that led directly to the war.
Directly. And if you trace back the European settlement history, you find the roots of the specific conflict between the British and the Boers.
It goes back to the Dutch, the French Huguenots, and then the British taking over.
Yes, and British rule led to widespread dissatisfaction among the original settlers, the Boers. This sparked something called the Great Trek, starting around 1836.
This was the Boers moving inland, trying to get away from British control.
Exactly. A whole series of migrations pushing deeper into the interior. And the geography made this incredibly difficult. You had these coastal mountain ranges separating the sort of narrow, fertile coast from the high, dry interior plateau, the veldt.
And these migrations seeking independence directly created the two Boer republics, right?
That's right. The Orange Free State, or OFS, and the South African Republic, better known as the Transvaal.
Would put them right on top of all that newly discovered mineral wealth.
And created this huge, sprawling, difficult-to-defend border with the British territories, the Cape Colony and Natal. So when Mahan analyzes the military situation, he immediately focuses on the absolute basics for any army fighting so far from home.
Lifelines. How do you sustain an army thousands of miles away?
You need ports and you need railways. Mahan identifies the two key British operational ports, Cape Town in the west and Durban in the east.
And he notes they weren't even great natural ports.
No, they were deficient. They needed significant artificial improvements, breakwaters, dredging, docks, just to handle the sheer volume of shipping that a major war effort would require.
And from those ports, you have the railways, these incredibly long, thin, vulnerable lines stretching deep into that interior plateau.
Lifelines is exactly the right word. Mahan calls them the main chain of communications, absolutely non-negotiable. You got the line from Cape Town snaking north, hundreds of miles through pretty desolate country, towards Kimberley, Mafeking, eventually Rhodesia.
And the other one from Durban, heading inland through Natal towards the Transvaal border.
Yes. And Mahan hammers this point home. The British Army, this huge modern force, a concentrated mass of life heretofore unknown in that region, was totally dependent on these rails.
The distances are just mind-boggling. What did you say? 750 miles to Bloemfontein, over 1,000 to Pretoria.
Staggering. And every single mile of that track was a potential point of failure, easily cut by a small group of Boer commandos on horseback.
Which could paralyze an entire British advance.
Completely. Now, paradoxically, the interior plateau itself, once you got up there, was relatively easy country to move across. Open rolling veldt. Mahan compared it to the ocean, few natural choke points, favoring movement.
But getting up there was the problem, those coastal mountains.
Exactly. The passes through those mountains, like the Hex River Pass near Cape Town, or the passes into Natal from the Free State, those are the critical strategic points, natural bottlenecks.
And the Boers knew this.
Oh, yes. Mahan mentions that part of the initial Boer War plan involved seizing the Hex River Pass near Cape Town and also cutting the Durban line to essentially strangle the British supply system right at the source.
Control the choke points, control the war. Makes sense. But there's another huge logistical problem inland, something biological. Horse sickness.
Ah, yes. This is a detail Mahan highlights, and it's crucial for understanding British limitations. You'd think, okay, the railway's vulnerable, let's supplement it with wagons, cavalry, mobile artillery moving alongside.
Standard practice.
But this local disease, African horse sickness, was devastating to imported horses. Mahan states it killed 3/4 of non-acclimated animals.
3/4. That's not just an inconvenience, that's catastrophic for mobility.
It essentially crippled the British ability to operate effectively away from the immediate vicinity of the railway lines. No wide-ranging cavalry sweeps, no rapid movement of supplies or guns by road.
So they were forced to rely on ox wagons.
Huge trains of slow, cumbersome ox wagons, which of course also needed massive amounts of fodder and water, further straining the logistics. This tethered the British Army to the railway track like an umbilical cord.
Making their movements predictable, easy for the Boers to anticipate and counter defensively. They couldn't just sweep around the Boer positions.
Not easily, no. It massively constrained their strategic options. Now, interestingly, Mahan makes a counterintuitive point about the Orange Free State joining the war.
Right, that increased the number of Boer fighters the British had to face. Seems like a disadvantage.
Numerically, yes. But strategically, Mahan argued it actually offered a compensating advantage to the British in the long run.
How so?
Because it opened up the central invasion route. Mahan believed the best, most direct path to the Boer capitals Bloemfontein and Pretoria was always via the railway line running north from Cape Town, straight through the Orange Free State.
Ah, so if the OFS had remained neutral, the British couldn't have used that route.
Exactly. They would have been forced to attack through Natal over those incredibly difficult, heavily fortified mountain passes into the Transvaal, a much harder prospect.
So the OFS joining the war, while adding more enemies, paradoxically opened up the strategically preferred invasion corridor.
Which Lord Roberts, as we'll see, later exploited brilliantly. It made the ultimate path to victory geographically clearer, even if the immediate fight got tougher.
Okay, so we've got the stage set. Isolated theater, vital ports, vulnerable railways, horse sickness crippling mobility. Now, the curtain rises. The war begins. The Boers, combining the forces of the Transvaal and the OFS, actually had a temporary local numerical advantage right at the start.
They did. For a few crucial weeks, they outnumbered the British forces available in South Africa, especially in Natal.
So standard military doctrine says, what should they have done?
Mahan is absolutely clear. When you're the weaker side overall, but you have a temporary local superiority, you must attack immediately.
Make us
aggressively.
hit hard, hit fast before the enemy can reinforce.
Precisely. They needed to smash the isolated British units, grab those key railway points like the Hex River Pass or the bridges over the Tugela River in Natal, destroy infrastructure, and ideally seize Durban to prevent landings.
But they didn't. There was this critical delay. The ultimatum was supposed to go out October 2nd, but it was held back until the 9th. Why?
Logistics. Simple as that. Mahan points out their supplies, food, ammunition weren't ready. It highlights the inherent difficulty of rapidly mobilizing and provisioning irregular militia-type forces compared to a professional army. Their transport system wasn't up to the task of an immediate offensive.
That week's delay. That sounds like it gave the British vital breathing room.
A lifetime in war, as you said. British reinforcements were already on the water, steaming from India and Britain. That delay allowed just enough time for some initial forces to arrive and strengthen the key positions, particularly Ladysmith and Natal.
But then the British made their own mistake, didn't they? The move to Dundee.
Ah, yes, the Dundee deployment.
Yeah.
This was a classic case of political considerations overriding sound military judgment.
General Sir George White, the British commander in Natal, he didn't want to send troops that far north, did he? To Glencoe and Dundee.
He was very much against it. Militarily, it was unsound. It pushed a significant force, about 4,000 men under General Penn Simons, way up into this exposed northern tip of Natal. A salient, sticking right out into Boer territory.
Easy to cut off.
Exactly. White knew it was vulnerable. But the government in London and the civilian governor in Natal insisted. Why? Politics and coal.
Coal?
The most important coal mines in Natal were located up there near Dundee. Securing that coal supply was deemed politically essential. Also, abandoning the area would have looked like weakness, potentially demoralizing loyal colonists, and maybe even encouraging unrest among the local Zulu population.
So White reluctantly agreed, against his better military judgment.
He yielded. And the Boers, naturally, saw the opportunity created by this acute salient angle, as Mahan called it.
They tried a pincer movement.
They did. The plan was for Commandant Lucas Meyer to attack Dundee from the east, while Commandant Erasmus attacked from the north. Simultaneously, another force under General Koch was sent to cut the railway line further south at Elandslaagte, completing the isolation.
Strategically sound on paper. Isolate and destroy.
Very sound. But Mahan notes the execution faltered. Boer coordination wasn't perfect. Meyer attacked on October 20th, hitting Kalana Hill just outside Dundee. But Erasmus, he just did not put in an appearance on time.
That failure to coordinate gave the British a chance.
It did. It allowed the British, though surprised and outnumbered at Talana, to concentrate their efforts against Meyer's force. And what followed was, according to Mahan, a magnificent feat of arms.
This is the Battle of Talana Hill. Tell us about it.
General Simons, despite being caught off guard, reacted with incredible speed and aggression. The Boers were well entrenched on the top of Talana Hill. It was about 800 feet high, steep, rocky.
A tough position to assault.
Very tough. The final climb was described as almost perpendicular. But Simons ordered a frontal assault. The British infantry advanced uphill, under heavy rifle fire. Simons himself was mortally wounded early on.
But they kept going.
They kept going, scaled the heights, drove the Boers off the summit, largely with a bayonet. It was costly, but successful.
And Mahan drew a specific lesson from this, didn't he? About modern weapons.
Yes, a really significant insight for the time. He concluded that even modern rapid-firing rifles cannot stop the uphill advance of a resolute infantry on broken ground. The sheer determination and momentum of the charge could overcome firepower, especially if the defender's nerve broke before close combat.
A huge psychological boost for the British, even though they lost their general.
Immense, and it was immediately followed by another success the very next day.
Elandslaagte.
This was the force that cut the railway.
Yes, General Koch's force. General French, who had only just arrived in Ladysmith, was immediately sent out with cavalry and infantry to deal with them. October 21st.
And French also attacked aggressively.
Very aggressively. The Boers were again in a strong position on a rocky ridge. And Mahan notes a fascinating detail here. The Boers used barbed wire.
Barbed wire in 1899 to impede an attack.
Yes. Specifically placed to try and funnel the British flank attack into killing zones. It shows, considerable tactical thinking on the defensive side, even this early.
Decades before it became the defining feature of World War I trenches. Indeed. But French's combined frontal and flanking attack was brilliantly executed. It broke the Boer line, cleared the railway, and inflicted significant casualties. Mahan really emphasizes the impact of these two quick, sharp British victories.
Palana and Elandslagte.
He says they established an immediate wholesome respect for British fighting ability and were demoralizing and daunting for the Boers, who perhaps expected easier initial success. They showed the British weren't just going to sit passively.
And these victories created the space for the Dundee force, now under General Ewell, to make that difficult retreat back to Ladysmith.
Exactly. A grueling 60-mile march, harried by the Boers, but they made it back, rejoining White's main force. So the initial political era of the Dundee position was, in a way, redeemed by tactical success and a skillful retreat.
But by early November, the Boers had regrouped, advanced, and closed the ring around Ladysmith. The siege began.
It did. But just before the investment was complete, there was one more major action, this time a British disaster. Nicholson's Neck, October 30th.
What went wrong there?
It was supposed to be a night flanking march to seize a hill protecting the British left flank as the Boers closed in. But things went badly wrong in the dark. There was confusion, possibly some boulders falling caused a panic among the transport mules carrying the reserve ammunition of the artillery and machine guns.
The mules bolted.
Stampeded.
Yes.
Scattered the vital ammunition across the veldt in the darkness. The infantry reached the neck, but then found themselves isolated, in confusion, and critically, without their artillery support or resupply.
Leading to a surrender.
Yes, a large one.
Ugh.
Over 840 British troops were captured. A really damaging blow just as the siege was tightening.
A terrible start to the siege. Yet, Ladysmith held out for 118 days. Mahan credits one specific factor arriving in the nick of time.
The naval guns. This was absolutely critical.
Tell us about Captain Lambton and the Naval Brigade. How did guns from a cruiser change the game in a land siege?
Well, the standard British Army field guns were actually being outranged by some of the Boers' modern siege guns, their Crusoe long-toms. The Boers could sit back comfortably and shell the town.
Which is demoralizing and destructive.
Hugely. But the Royal Navy, anticipating this, had already prepared. Captain Percy Scott had designed improvised land carriages for heavy naval guns. A detachment from HMS Powerful, under Captain Hedworth Lambton, rushed two big 4.7-inch guns and four long-range 12-pounders up to Ladysmith just as the siege began.
And these guns had longer range.
Significantly longer. Mahan calculated they outranged the main Boer field guns by about 2,000 yards. That might not sound like much, but in siege terms, it's enormous.
Why is that extra range so important?
Because it forced the Boers to pull their own artillery further back. Mahan says it extended by at least double that distance the diameter of the circle of investment imposed upon the enemy. They couldn't get their guns close enough to be truly effective without coming under fire from the naval guns.
Gave the defenders breathing space.
Exactly. Sir George White himself later admitted that without those naval guns, the Boers would have established batteries much closer, the bombardment would have been unbearable, mortality would have skyrocketed, and holding the town likely impossible. It stabilized the entire defense.
So Ladysmith held. Why was holding this specific town so strategically vital? Mahan compares it to famous historical sieges.
He does. He calls Ladysmith Genoa in 1800. Or Plevna in 1877, and we need to understand what he means by that.
Okay, unpack those analogies for us. Genoa, Plevna.
It's about a force fixing the enemy. In 1800, the French general Massena held Genoa against the Austrians. His stubborn defense tied up a huge Austrian army for weeks, preventing them from concentrating against Napoleon elsewhere, which directly contributed to Napoleon's victory at Marengo.
So Genoa acted like a strategic magnet, drawing in enemy forces.
Precisely. And Plevna, in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, was a hastily fortified Turkish position that held up the main Russian advance for months, costing them dearly and disrupting their entire campaign plan.
So Ladysmith, by holding out, did the same thing to the Boers.
Exactly. Because Ladysmith sat astride the only major railway junction in Natal, the Boers couldn't just bypass it and invade deeper into the colony. If they did, White's garrison could potentially sally out and cut their supply lines.
A constant threat in their rear.
A constant threat. It forced the Boers to commit a huge portion of their total strength, maybe up to 30,000 men at times, simply to containing Ladysmith. Men who could have been used far more effectively elsewhere, like reinforcing Cronje on the Western Front, or sweeping through the weakly defended Cape Colony.
So the defense of Ladysmith wasn't just about saving the garrison, it was about distorting the whole Boer War effort.
Fundamentally, Mahan argues if the Boers had possessed what he called Napoleon's exclusiveness of purpose, That laser focus on the main military objective, they would have masked Ladysmith with a smaller force, ignored the Cape frontier initially, and thrown everything into crushing the main British field army or seizing Durban.
But they didn't. They got bogged down in sieges.
They got bogged down. White's stubborn defense of Ladysmith compelled them to divide their forces, and that division, Mahan argues, was the seed of their eventual strategic failure.
Okay, so while all this high drama is playing out in Natal, the battles, the siege Mahan pulls our focus back, way back, 6,000 miles back, to the engine driving the British war effort, the logistics.
And he describes the transport of men, animals, and supplies across that immense distance as simply unprecedented in military history up to that point.
The scale sounds staggering.
It truly was. Mahan gives these incredible figures. Between late October 1899 and the end of March 1900, roughly 162 days, Britain shipped out 166,277 officers and men.
Plus, over 1,000 men every single day, sailing halfway around the world during wartime.
Averaging over 1,000 a day. Plus horses, guns, ammunition, food, fodder, equipment, everything needed to sustain a modern army. It was a monumental organizational achievement.
He gives examples of specific ships, doesn't he, to illustrate the capacity?
He does. The liner Cymric, for example, was converted to carry an entire Royal Artillery Brigade division that's 18 field guns, 430 horses, 351 gunners and drivers, plus an entire infantry battalion. Nearly 1,600 men and all their kit and animals on one ship.
Wow. And the Kildonan Castle.
Even bigger troop carrier, capable of carrying 2,700 men per voyage. The sheer volume being moved required, as Mahan put it, a triumph of organization and system.
And he credits the success not to the Army's War Office, but specifically to the Navy's Admiralty. Why was that distinction important?
Because the Admiralty, specifically its transport department under Rear Admiral Bouverie Clark, had been managing Britain's global shipping and troop movements for decades. They had the experience, the procedures, the relationships with civilian shipping lines. It was a professional, institutionalized system.
He contrasts this sharply with the American experience in the Spanish-American War just a year or two earlier.
Very sharply. He points to the chaos and inefficiency of the U.S. Army managing its own sea transport out of Tampa, Florida confusion, delays, poor coordination. The British system, run by the Admiralty, was vastly superior.
What made it so efficient under pressure? It wasn't just having lots of ships, presumably.
No, it was the system. Mahan talks about the gradual elaboration of regulation, decades of refinement. They knew exactly how long it took to convert different types of merchant ships, about 2 weeks for an infantry transport, maybe 4 weeks for cavalry transport needing stables and extra ventilation.
And the procedures on the ground, at the ports like Southampton.
Minutely regulated. He describes trains pulling directly onto the wharves alongside the ships. No delays transferring men or material. Muskets were labeled to match specific racks on board. Non-commissioned officers knew exactly which mess deck to take their men to.
Seamless integration.
Almost assembly line precision. Mahan recounts how the 1st Army Brigade to sail from Southampton, about 5,000 troops, had been in barracks miles inland the night before. Yet they were fully loaded, provisioned, and the ships were steaming out to sea before dark the next day. All managed smoothly by experienced NCOs and naval staff working together.
Incredible efficiency. A logistical masterpiece, moving hundreds of thousands of men 6,000 miles. But even this system hit a wall once the troops arrived in South Africa, didn't it?
Yes. The efficiency of the sea voyage was one thing. Disembarking and moving inland was another. Mahan highlights the severe local congestion at the destination ports, Cape Town and Durban.
The local infrastructure just couldn't cope with that volume.
It was overwhelmed. Ports, railways, storage facilities, they simply weren't designed to handle such a massive, sudden influx. Mahan uses this as a warning, actually.
A warning about what?
About assumptions in strategic planning. He cautions anyone assuming that, say, in a future war where the Suez Canal was closed, all that global shipping traffic could simply be rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope without issue.
Because the ports there wouldn't be able to handle it.
Precisely. You need the local infrastructure, the organization, the conveniences, as he puts it, to manage that kind of volume. You can't just magically transfer capacity.
And this port congestion fed directly into the problems inland.
Directly. Even with all the men and supplies arriving, getting them forward to the fighting fronts was incredibly difficult. The inadequate railway system Mahan mentioned earlier became the critical bottleneck within the theater of war.
So Britain might have immense resources, but the local delivery system was the choke point.
Absolutely. The sheer quantity of supplies needed food, fodder, ammunition, medical supplies, engineering stores required constant massive accumulation at the railheads before any major advance could happen.
Which explains the pauses in the campaign.
It explains the pauses. It explains why the British Army remained so dependent on the railway. And it explains why, later on, even after major victories, Lord Roberts had to halt for weeks, like the month-long pause at Bloemfontein, simply to rebuild his supplies before pushing further. Logistics, as always, dictated the pace and scope of strategy.
Okay, so Natal is locked in the siege of Ladysmith, and the British are pouring troops in, but facing logistical bottlenecks. Meanwhile, what's happening on that other huge front, the western frontier, bordering the Cape Colony and the Orange Free State?
Well, initially, almost nothing from the British side. Mahan calls the situation there a most regrettable necessity. Meaning because Britain had prioritized holding Natal, partly for political reasons, partly because the main Boer threat seemed focused there. Initially, the vast western frontier was left dangerously exposed.
How exposed?
We're talking about a 500-mile border, from Basutoland up to Mafeking near the Transvaal border. And the total British force guarding it in the first weeks was tiny, maybe 4,100 men, mostly scattered in small detachments at key railway junctions like De Aar, Noport, Stormberg.
And this was risky because the local population in the Cape Colony
Was largely Dutch descended, and many were sympathetic to the Boer republics. A swift, decisive Boer invasion into the Cape could have potentially ignited a widespread rebellion, cutting British communications and massively expanding the conflict.
a huge opportunity for the Boers then. Crush those weak detachments, cut the vital Cape Town-Kimberley railway, maybe even inspire that rebellion.
Absolutely. That's what sound military strategy, that exclusiveness of purpose Mahan talks about, would have dictated. Concentrate force, strike decisively at the enemy's weakest point, and vital communications.
Again, they didn't do that.
No. Instead of a swift invasion, they opted for sieges.
Sieges again, like Ladysmith.
Yes. They invested the small town of Mafeking, famous for Baden-Powell's defense, and the much more important diamond mining center of Kimberley. Mahan argues this is a fundamental strategic error.
Why? What was wrong with besieging Kimberley? It was important, held by Rhodes himself for a time.
Important economically and symbolically, yes. But militarily, Mahan argues, these sieges became distractions. They tied down thousands of Boer fighters, men who could have been used far more effectively in mobile operations against the railways or the weak British field forces. It turned into a war of posts, a static defensive mindset when they needed to be offensive.
It diluted their strength.
It diluted their strength, and crucially, it wasted their most precious resource, time. While the Boers sat around Mafeking and Kimberley, British reinforcements were pouring into the country.
And there's that great anecdote about President Kruger and General Cronje over Mafeking that illustrates this flawed thinking perfectly.
It really does. General Pete Cronje, who was commanding the Boers on the Western Front, was actually a reasonably competent commander. He initially wanted to launch an immediate assault on Mafeking, believing he could take it quickly, even if it cost casualties.
Get it over with and move on.
Exactly. But President Paul Kruger, the political leader of the Transvaal, overruled him. Kruger reportedly said Mafeking was not worth the lives of 50 burghers. He ordered Cronje simply to contain the town, prevent Baden-Powell from escaping, but not to risk a costly assault.
So political caution over military decisiveness again, but this time on the Boer side.
Yes, and Mahan sees this as stemming from Kruger's limited, localized perspective. He was thinking about saving Boer lives in a small fight, not about the larger strategic imperative of freeing up thousands of men for decisive action elsewhere. That decision kept around 3,000 Boers tied up around Mafeking for months.
Time the British used to assemble a relief force.
Precisely. The threat to Kimberley in particular spurred the British into action. They gathered a substantial force, about 10,000 men, under Lieutenant General Lord Methuen at the Orange River Railway Bridge. His mission? Advance north along the railway and relieve Kimberley.
An advance completely tied to that single vulnerable railway line because of the transport issues we discussed.
Absolutely. Methuen had very limited cavalry and transport, forcing him into a direct, predictable advance right into the teeth of the Boer defenses.
And this led to a series of very bloody battles where the Boers showed they were rapidly learning and adapting their tactics. What were they doing initially?
Initially, at battles like Belmont on November 23rd and Graspan, or Enslan, on November 25th, the Boers used the terrain feature of the kopjes.
Kopjes, those isolated rocky hills common on the veldt.
Exactly. They occupied the tops of these kopjes using the height and rocks for cover. The British response was straightforward, if costly. Direct frontal assaults by the infantry.
And the British infantry proved they could take these positions.
They did. Mahan again uses these battles to reinforce his point from Talana Hill. Sheer infantry grit and determination could overcome firepower and difficult terrain, driving the Boers off the summits.
But the Boers didn't just stand and fight to the last man, did they?
No, and this was key to their tactical success, even in defeat. Their great strength was mobility. Mahan notes that in both Belmont and Grasstown, the Boers inflicted significant casualties on the attacking British, held them up for a while, and then mounted their horses, which were always kept safe and ready behind the kachis, and simply rode away before they could be decisively engaged or captured.
Frustrating for the British.
Extremely. Mathena repeatedly lamented his lack of sufficient cavalry and horse artillery to pursue effectively and reap the fruits of his hard-won infantry victories. Mahan actually compares this Boer tactic inflict damage, then withdraw to historical French naval tactics, which he often criticized for prioritizing saving ships over decisive fleet action.
Interesting comparison. Win the fight, but lose the war, potentially.
Potentially. This hit-and-run defense forced Methuen to keep grinding forward, paying a price for every mile. And the Boers continued to adapt.
Which brings us to the Battle of Modder River on November 28th. What changed here?
This was a nasty surprise for Methuen. He expected the Boers to be defending the Kopjes north of the Modder River. Instead, he stumbled onto about 8,000 Boers, commanded by Cronje and De la Rey, concealed and entrenched not on the hills, but right in the banks of the Modder River itself, and the Riot River which joins it there.
Down in the riverbed, using the natural banks and maybe dongas, those dry gullies.
Exactly. They were almost invisible until the British advance guard walked right into their rifle fire at close range. It caused immediate heavy casualties and pinned the British down for hours under a scorching sun.
A very clever use of terrain for concealment. How did the British break the deadlock?
Eventually, after hours of being pinned, they discovered an unguarded ford, or drift, way over on their right flank. British troops managed to cross the Riot River there and began to turn the Boer left flank. Simultaneously, other troops found a way across the Modder further downstream. Threatened with encirclement, the Boers evacuated their positions overnight.
Another British victory, but again, costly, and demonstrating the Boers' tactical ingenuity.
Very costly. And it set the stage for the biggest shock of all on the Western Front, Magersfontein, on December 11th. This is one of the 3 defeats of Black Week that stunned Britain.
What made Magersfontein so different, so disastrous?
It was Cronje and De la Rey again, and they took the lesson of Modder River concealment one step further. Methuen planned a night march, followed by a dawn assault on the Magersfontein Hills, which dominated the approach to Kimberley. He assumed the Boers would be on the slopes or the crest of the hills.
The conventional place to put your defenses.
Exactly. But De la Rey, a brilliant tactical innovator, persuaded Cronje to dig their trenches at the foot of the main Magersfontein kopje on the flat ground in front of him.
At the bottom. Why there?
Several reasons. It meant the British artillery, firing from a distance, couldn't easily see or hit the trenches. Shells would likely fly over them and hit the empty hillside behind. It also meant the attacking infantry would have absolutely no cover as they approached across the open veldt. And crucially, it was completely unexpected.
And the British walked right into it.
Literally, the Highland Brigade, led by the respected General Wauchope, was chosen to lead the dawn attack. They marched through the night in heavy rain, navigating by compass in a very dense formation, massed quarter columns to maintain cohesion.
A tight formation, easy to control in the dark, but a perfect target if caught deploying.
A perfect target. Just as dawn was breaking, probably around 200-400 yards from the hidden Boer line, they were preparing to deploy into open order for the assault, and the Boers opened fire.
From concealed trenches, possibly behind barbed wire as well.
Yes. Reports mention barbed wire in front of the trenches, adding to the horror. The Highlanders were caught completely by surprise in that vulnerable, bunched formation. The result was instant chaos, devastating casualties, and the death of General Wauchope. The attack completely disintegrated before it even began.
A tactical masterpiece by the Boers, a catastrophe for the British.
It absolutely was. The combination of concealment, the unexpected trench location, possibly wire, and hitting the enemy at that critical moment of deployment under fire, it broke the assault completely. Methuen's advance was stopped dead in its tracks, just short of Kimberley.
And Magersfontein, along with Stormberg in the Cape and Colenso and Natal, all within a few days, that's Black Week.
That's Black Week. A series of shocking defeats that forced a fundamental rethink in London. The initial strategy of trying to advance on multiple fronts with insufficient force, relying on frontal assaults against adaptable defenders, had demonstrably failed.
The only bright spot seemed to be General French's mobile operations further south.
Yes, Around Colesburg in the Cape Colony, French, with a smaller, more mobile force, was skillfully keeping a larger Boer force occupied, using maneuver rather than direct assault, preventing them from reinforcing Cronje or invading deeper into the Cape. His success there hinted at the kind of warfare that might actually work.
Okay, so Black Week Majorsfontein, Stormberg, Colenso, it's a disaster. Public confidence is shaken. The army seems stalled everywhere. London has to react.
And they react decisively. They appoint Field Marshal Lord Roberts, Britain's most famous and respected soldier, as the new commander-in-chief, with Lord Kitchener, the hero of Omdurman, as his chief of staff.
A signal that Britain is now taking this war extremely seriously, committing its top talent and vast resources. Roberts arrives when?
He arrives in Cape Town on January 10, 1900, and his arrival, Mahan emphasizes, marks a complete shift in strategy. No more piecemeal efforts, no more head-on assaults against prepared positions if avoidable.
He goes back to that original strategic idea Mahan favored.
Exactly. Roberts immediately recognizes the key is the central invasion route through the Orange Free State. Forget trying to smash through Cronje's Majorsfontein lines directly. The plan is now to bypass him.
A flanking maneuver.
A massive flanking maneuver. The objective: get around Cronje's eastern flank, seize the vital drifts or fords on the Modder and Riot rivers behind him, cutting his communications with Bloemfontein, the OFS capital.
And the key instrument for this kind of move has to be cavalry, right? Speed, mobility.
Absolutely. And Roberts has the perfect man for the job. General John French, who had been performing so well down at Colesburg.
So French is pulled away from Colesburg.
Yes. Roberts summons French and the bulk of his cavalry division, a powerful force of about 4,800 troopers plus horse artillery, for this critical mission. Secrecy and speed are paramount.
How did they achieve that secrecy in moving such a large force?
By doing the unexpected. Instead of moving north directly towards Cronje, French first moves south and then swings wide to the east, marching far away from the railway line and Cronje's known positions.
Playing on that Boer assumption that the British were tied to the rails.
Exactly. Cronje seems to have discounted the possibility of the British moving such a large force, especially cavalry needing water and fodder, so far out into the dry veldt, away from the railway.
And French's march was fast.
Relentless. They covered over 40 miles in incredibly hot, difficult conditions, starting around February 11th. By February 13th, they suddenly appeared at Klipdrift on the Riot River, east of Cronje, surprising the Boer detachments guarding it, seizing the ford and capturing supplies.
A complete shock to Cronje. Suddenly the British are behind him.
Completely wrong-footed him. And French didn't stop. Leaving infantry to secure the drift, he pushed his cavalry north towards the Modder River, seizing another key crossing, Klipfral Drift.
This puts him squarely between Cronje and Bloemfontein and positions him for the first objective.
The relief of Kimberley. By February 15th, French gathered his force, now reinforced closer to maybe 5,000 effectives despite horse exhaustion, and made a final dash. They galloped straight through the remaining Boer lines investing Kimberley and rode into the besieged town.
Kimberley relieved. But more importantly, strategically, the British cavalry is now firmly planted on Cronje's line of retreat.
That's the crucial outcome. Cronje realizes his Majorsfontein position, which had seemed impregnable just days before, is now completely untenable. He's been outflanked.
So he has to retreat. Which way does he go?
He has to go east, shadowing the Modder River, hoping to get back towards Bloemfontein. But Mahan points out the fatal decision Cronje makes here.
Which is?
His unwillingness to drop his enormous train of wagons, hundreds of them, carrying supplies, ammunition, families even, and his heavy guns. He tries to retreat with everything.
Valuing his stuff over speed and mobility.
Exactly. That cumbersome wagon train slowed his retreat to a crawl, maybe only 5 or 6 miles a day. And French's cavalry, despite their horses being exhausted, was still faster.
So French could intercept him.
French swung his cavalry north and east again, getting ahead of Cronje's slow column. On February 17th, near Kudusrand Drift, French managed to block Cronje's path, forcing the Boer general to halt and form a defensive laager, a circle of wagons in the bed of the Modder River at a place called Wolfskraal near Paardeberg.
Trapped. And then the British infantry caught up.
Yes, the leading British infantry divisions, which had been following French's route, arrived quickly. By the 18th, Cronje and his roughly 4,000 fighters were surrounded.
So Cronje begins the battle or siege of Paardeberg. Was there another frontal assault?
There was an initial very costly one on February 18th led by Kitchener before Roberts arrived on the scene. It gained some ground but resulted in heavy British casualties, the highest single-day loss for the British in the war.
But when Roberts arrived on the 19th, he changed tactics.
Immediately, having seen the futility of frontal assaults at Magersfontein, Roberts forbids any more large-scale infantry attacks. Instead, he decides to use his overwhelming superiority in artillery.
The bombardment Mahan mentioned. How intense was it?
It was relentless and concentrated. Roberts gathered nearly every gun he had, maybe 45 to 50 pieces, and pounded the confined Boer laager from relatively close range around 2,000 yards.
Not just harassment fire, but aimed at destruction.
Complete saturation. Mahan describes the effect. Huge explosions as Boer ammunition wagons were hit, constant shelling making movement impossible, and, critically, the destruction of the Boers' animals.
Killing their horses and oxen.
Yes, an estimated 75% of the remaining animals were killed by the shelling or lack of fodder. This meant no chance of breaking out, even if they could fight their way through. Plus, the riverbed position became increasingly foul and disease-ridden with dead animals and waste. Conditions became unbearable.
Escape was impossible. Surrender was inevitable.
It was. After holding out under this relentless pressure for 10 days, Cronje surrendered his entire force on February 27, 1900.
And the date, February 27th, that was significant.
Highly significant. It was Majuba Day, the anniversary of the humiliating British defeat by the Boers back in 1881. The symbolism was immense. A huge morale boost for the British, a devastating blow to the Boers.
And Mahan saw Paardeberg as the ultimate vindication of Roberts' strategy.
Absolutely. The dislodging and capture of a formidable enemy force, not by costly frontal assault, but by a secret and rapid flank march, followed by a swift pursuit, ending in the enforced surrender. Minimum loss for the victor, maximum result. It proved the power of maneuver over static defense.
While all this is happening out west, the relief of Kimberley, the trapping of Cronje, what about Natal? Buller was still stuck outside Ladysmith.
Yes, but Roberts' offensive had a knock-on effect. Buller launched his own final, determined attempt to relieve Ladysmith starting around February 12th, partly to coincide with Roberts' move and prevent Boers from reinforcing Cronje.
Buller had failed several times already, at Colenso, Spijnkop, Valkrans. What did he do differently this time?
He seemed to have learned, finally. Instead of direct assaults across the Tugela River against the main Boer positions, he focused first on methodically securing the Boer left flank, south of the river. This involved capturing key hills like Monte Cristo and, crucially, Llangwain Hill.
Why was Llangwain so important?
Because it overlooked Colenso and the Boer positions north of the river. Once the British held Llangwain, the Boers' original defensive line became untenable. They were forced to pull back into a series of extremely strong, entrenched positions in the hills west of Colenso, places like Peters Hill, Railway Hill, Inniskilling Hill.
So Buller still had a tough fight ahead.
A very tough fight. For about a week from February 21st onwards, there was intense attritional fighting as the British tried to batter their way through these formidable defenses. Casualties were heavy again, nearly 1,900 in that final week.
But the final breakthrough came when, coinciding with Cronje's surrender.
Exactly on the same day, February 27th, Majuba Day. The decisive action was the storming of Peters Hill, the key to the Boer left flank in this new line. Mahan describes Barton's brigade scaling an almost precipitous cliff of about 500 feet under heavy fire to take the summit.
Another tough infantry assault.
Yes, but this time it unhinged the entire Boer position. Once Peters Hill fell, the adjacent positions were carried by sunset. The Boer line finally broke. They retreated overnight, completely demoralized by the news of Cronje's surrender filtering through as well.
And Ladysmith was finally relieved the next day.
February 28th. Dundonald cavalry rode into the town, ending the 118-day siege.
So within basically 2 weeks in February 1900, the entire strategic picture of the war is transformed.
Completely reversed. Kimberley relieved, Cronje's main Western Army captured, Ladysmith relieved. The Boer strategy based on sieges and static defense was shattered.
And Robert's central advance could now proceed.
Yes. The path to Bloemfontein was open. The Boers were forced onto the defensive everywhere, retreating, regrouping, and ultimately transitioning towards the guerrilla warfare phase that would define the rest of the long conflict. But the conventional war, Mahan suggests, was essentially decided in those crucial weeks of February 1900. #outro.
So looking back at this deep dive into Mahan's analysis of those first 6 months, it really is a powerful lesson in strategy, logistics, and adaptation in warfare. What would you say are the absolute key takeaways Mahan wanted readers and us today to grasp?
I think there are three main ones that stand out from his analysis. First, the immense strategic value of a fleet in being, or in this case, an army in being, even if besieged. Ladysmith's stubborn defense, Mahan argues, was absolutely fundamental because it acted like that Plevna or Genoa. It tied down a disproportionate number of Boer forces and prevented them from concentrating elsewhere at a critical time.
Right, the passive threat was as important as active fighting. What's second?
Second, the sheer unprecedented success of the British logistical system in projecting power across 6,000 miles. Despite the bottlenecks at the end, the ability to move and supply hundreds of thousands of men consistently was a triumph of organization, driven by the Admiralty's professionalism and detailed regulations. It showed the immense power of system in modern warfare.
A lesson in the importance of the often unglamorous side of war. And the third key takeaway.
The ultimate triumph of maneuver over frontal assault, embodied by Robert's flank march leading to Paardeberg. It broke the Boer reliance on static defense and siege warfare by rendering their strongest positions irrelevant. It proved that speed, secrecy, and attacking the enemy's communications and mobility were decisive against even brave and tactically adept defenders.
And Mahan's final verdict on why the Boers, despite their early advantages and tactical skill, failed strategically in this opening phase.
He puts it down to their lack of exclusiveness of purpose. They failed to maintain a single, clear military objective. They allowed political considerations, like holding territory or avoiding casualties in minor fights like Mafeking, to override the need to concentrate their forces and strike decisively at the British Army or its communications when it was weakest.
They hesitated. They divided their efforts between Natal, Kimberley, Mafeking, the Cape frontier.
Exactly. And that hesitation, that division, coupled with the surprising resilience and occasional brilliance of the British counterattacks like Talana, Illenslaak, and later French's operations, allowed the British time to bring their overwhelming logistical power to bear.
It's fascinating how many of the British successes seem to come after initial errors, almost redeeming them. Dundee was a mistake, but Talana and Illenslaat were successes. The initial strategy led to Black Week, but Robert's flanking move redeemed it.
And that leads directly to Mahan's final, really provocative thought, something he leaves hanging for future commanders and for us to think about. He explicitly argues that the initial British strategy, dividing forces to try and simultaneously relieve Ladysmith and Kimberley, was fundamentally unsound by classic military principles. It risked disaster on both fronts.
But worked out in the end, largely due to Roberts and French.
It worked out because of brilliant execution and Boer mistakes. Robert's flanking march was masterful, and Cronje's slowness sealed his fate. Buller eventually succeeded through sheer persistence and firepower. But Mahan implies the initial plan was flawed, driven perhaps by political pressure to save both besieged towns simultaneously.
So the strategy was wrong, but the tactics and leadership saved the day.
That seems to be his implication, which raises a really difficult question, the one we can leave you, the listener, to ponder. In a really tough military situation, especially when political pressures are immense, public outcry to save the besieged, economic factors like coal mines, is a commander ever justified in violating sound military principles?
Trusting that maybe operational brilliance or just sheer fighting spirit on the ground will somehow pull victory from the jaws of a flawed strategy.
Exactly. Mahan seems skeptical, suggesting the risk Roberts took was enormous, even if it paid off. Is it ever right to bet against the odds, against doctrine, hoping for genius or luck to redeem a fundamentally risky plan?
A very tough question about the balance between military science and the often messy realities of command in wartime. A perfect point to end on. Thank you for guiding us through Mahan's unique perspective on this conflict.
It was my pleasure. Mahan's insights remain incredibly relevant.
This has been The Deep Dive. Join us next time as we delve into another crucial piece of research.